So when, given that factories are so convenient to use and they, you can create these complex networks of objects, when would you actually want to use fixtures for something? So would we, for example, in a test suite about rotten potatoes, would we fixture movies and ratings? I have argued that we probably would not, because since those are the kinds of things that tests are going to be about, you want the flexibility to just sort of create the ones you need for each specific test case. What about something like the TMDB API key? If, our app calls out to TMDB, the app realistically cannot operate without it. It tends not to change over the lifetime of the app running. I think that's a reasonable thing to fixture under the circumstances. What about something like, the app's time zone setting? Probably similar situation, right? It's probably used all over the place. So it may or may not matter what it is, but it should be something consistent. How about this one? Suppose that, if the app has a notion of users logging in, there's one user who's like the administrative user who can do anything and has magical powers. Fixture or factory? Here's my challenge to you. Make a case for both. Make a case for, on the one hand, why the super user account should not be something that is fixtured, but should be factoried only when necessary. What happens if the admin account gets deleted? In practice, if an app really just has a single super user admin account, it's probably pretty important that that account be there, right? And in fact, I can imagine, in your test suite, you probably have a bunch of tests where you're checking that somebody can only do certain things if they're acting as the admin account, but that a regular user wouldn't be able to do those things. So even though, from one perspective, you could say, well, a super user is just another user. If you're not fixturing your models, why should you fixture that? But you could also potentially say, well, okay, but this is a special user. It participates in a lot of tests. There's, in a real app, there would always be one admin user that would always have to exist, or the app sort of wouldn't run. All of this is to say, there's usually not a right and wrong answer in every single case, right? If you ever see a question on an exam where you're supposed to say if it's true or false, and if the question contains the words always or never, you should be suspicious immediately. Because in like so many other things in software engineering, there's a certain amount of engineering taste and judgment here. So should you fixture the super user admin account? Maybe. It depends on the nature of your test suite, how many tests actually use it, whether in real life it would be realistic for there never to be an admin account. And so, you can make a case either way. And the important thing is that you learn to think about what the rationale is, not to memorize the answer. So, did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's also worth thinking about that, when you build an application, right? And this is where stuff gets a little bit complicated about what's right. But, you might have the invariant that this app will not run unless an admin account is present. That might seem like an odd constraint, but oftentimes setting up these constraints can make your life as a programmer easier. These are two ways of thinking about test data, but they're also not the only way, right? In our development environments and maybe in your production environment, we have seeds that set up the database. We have whether or not you use fixtures or factories, you get to choose when to load those things. All of them sort of answer the question, right, of like, what should this environment look like at this particular state? And how important is it that that thing is consistent across, a series of, just your model test cases, all of your test cases. And so, I think that's the question that you sort of want to ask is like, by simplifying the world, making some assumption, can I make my life easier? And from that, then you have to, taste is hard earned in engineering.
Yes, taste is hard earned, but it's the thing people pay you for. Yes. Anybody can get to the point where they can write code, but to think about the design and, what code you should write is the harder part. And that's the part that makes valuable software engineers, I think. One sort of parting note on the topic of mock objects of various kinds versus fixtures and factories when you need a real object. Sometimes you'll find yourself writing code that just don't feel right. And when that happens, it's because it's trying to tell you something about your design. And one of the sort of anti-patterns that can come up in this way when we're talking about testing is what's called a mock train wreck. So this is the example where, let's say that we're trying to test something that involves searching for a movie by its director or by the awards that it received. And you might see that in your test, you end up having expectations like this, where you talk about m.award.type or m.director.names. And the problem here, there's actually a couple of problems. When we talk about design smells, we're going to talk about why, when you see multiple dots in a row like this, you should be a little bit suspicious. The problem is to set this up using doubles. First, you'd have to make a double for an award, and it has to be at least smart enough to respond to type, because your expectation is going to check that. And you've got to set up a double that stands in for the director, and it has to be at least smart enough to respond to name because your expectation is going to check that. And now finally, you set up a double for the movie, and it has to be smart enough to respond to award or director and pass those objects, which are themselves mocks. So that's why this is called a mock train wreck. You're basically creating this chain of fake objects just because you're going to have expectations where you're inspecting not just, if I think of award as being a friend of a movie, type is like a friend of a friend. And that is an inappropriate level of intimacy. So what this is trying to tell you is that there's something about the structure of your code that's not quite right. If you have a movie and there is a place in the code where you care about the type of the movie's award or the name of the movie's director, then the movie class itself should find a way to abstract those things. Because otherwise, there's a risk that the movie class knows too much about the implementation of awards or about the implementation of directors, right? So another way to think of this is that it's okay to call a method on your friends, but it's not really okay to call a method on friends of friends. So if you find yourself sort of setting up these chains of mocks, it'll work. I mean, you can get this test case to work, but what it's really telling you is something about the structure of your code needs to be improved because you have a scenario where the movie has to know way too much about the implementation of awards and directors in order to test the behavior of the movie. If that's really the case, the movie class should encapsulate how to test that behavior. And when we talk about design patterns, one of the patterns we'll talk about is called delegation, which basically allows you to do that. It allows you to have the movie class present those abstractions, even though the way it's implemented is it just sort of delegates control of those to the objects with which it's associated. So watch out for the mock train wrecks.